We are live. There's something I'd actually been I was trying to explain to Des, and I think people who are listening would be very intrigued by Moshe's story about how he came to develop this, because he clearly saw something through, from what you were telling me, from a very young age, he was observing people and their reactions, their physical reactions. And I'm curious, I would like you to actually speak on that, because
Sure.
To me, that would actually develop that's part of the self-image, the way we respond, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Moshe, he was born in Russia, and I don't remember the name of the province or the town. And at the age of 14, he decided to go to Palestine, and he took off with a backpack and a pistol in his boot, and he took a 2-year journey to get to Palestine. Along the way, he collected friends and other travelers, and when he got there, he worked as a laborer, and there were also fights that they would have with the Arabs. So the Arabs and the Jews would have these fights. The English had control of the territory at the time, and they prevented any firearms being used in the area. So it was all hand-to-hand combat, bottles, sticks, knives, that kind of thing. And so as a young man, Moshe noticed that his friends didn't always fare so well in these fights, and so he and they started studying jiu-jitsu, and so they practiced jiu-jitsu. And there was a kind of a secret organization formed called the Haganah, to which Moshe was a member. And the Haganah was a group of Jewish people who would protect their lands from raids from the Arabs. And so he showed even an uncanny ability at the young age, in his teens and his early 20s, to see things differently than most people did. So he would, in his desire to come up with better self-defense techniques, he would go out with a friend. His friend would have a camera, and Moshe would startle somebody coming out from the doorway. The friend would take a picture, and they'd document this person's reaction. It's a spontaneous reaction, and then Moshe would work to turn that into a self-defense technique. And out of this study came a book called Jiu-Jitsu and Self-Defense, which he published in the early 30s, 31, before he went to France. He also, before that, he had published, he translated a book of Coué's. Coué was an early pioneer in hypnosis. He came up with this idea of autosuggestion. So if you've ever heard somebody say, getting better in every day in every way, that's a Couéism. And so he translated this book from English to Hebrew, and he added a couple of chapters. And these chapters were about the somatic applications of Coué's work to how can you be forward thinking and forward planning, instead of trying to resolve problems, but to achieve more of what you want by better movement. And so this is kind of this basic idea that he was thinking about even then. The Feldenkrais method wasn't even a glimmer in his eye, wasn't even a thought. It was decades away from being realized. So from there he goes to France. He gets his PhD. He's working on nuclear technology. And while he's there, he is introduced to Kano, the developer of judo. And judo, self-defense technique, and Kano was the developer of that. Kano was giving a presentation, and Moshe suggested that he go to this presentation. He had no ticket, so he went there, and he was denied access. And so went back to his apartment. He got his book on jiu-jitsu and self-defense that he wrote, and he handed it to the guys at the door, and about 20 minutes later, they come back and they let him in. And he gets a front row seat. He's watching these judo masters, just toss each other around on the stage. And he says in an interview at one point in time, he says, it just looks silly to me. It looked like I could take any one of those guys. And Moshe was a tough guy. You got to tell you, Moshe was a tough man. And so he was asked to meet with Kano, and they had dinner and they talked. And Kano was very impressed with Moshe, and he asked him to demonstrate this knife technique that was in his book. And so he did, and they demonstrated other techniques, and Khan was very impressed with Moshe. And so he took him on as a judo student, and Moshe helped to establish the French Judo Association and establish judo in the West. He was one of the first Westerners to get a black belt in judo.
Oh, wow.
And so the story continues to get more interesting in some ways, in that but now the Germans are coming into France, and he is tasked with taking these secret papers out of Germany and getting them to a special location, which is England. And so he's having a hard time getting out of the country. And he manages to finally get on this barge, this freighter, who's captained by none other than Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books. So he gets to England, and they see his name, Feldenkrais, and they go, that sounds German, you're going into an internment camp. So he's put in an internment camp. Somebody sees his name that recognizes him, and he gets pulled out of the internment camp, and he goes on to join the Admiralty and work as a scientist and work with other scientists and teach judo, where he writes, I think 4 other books on judo and martial arts. And then about the late 40s, early 50s, he starts working on his ideas that are laying the foundation to what would be the Feldenkrais method. So his books, Body and Mature Behavior, The Potent Self, and Higher Judo are written about that same time frame. And so he's doing a lot of work in science and lecturing and all this, and so you kind of see it starting to come together. In fact, if you read the first 2 chapters in Higher Judo, and you take out the word judo and you put in Feldenkrais method, they are the same. He speaks of Feldenkrais method later, as he did in judo, in Higher Judo.
And that's the name of the book, Higher Judo?
Higher Judo, yeah. And he came to see judo as a way to complete one's maturity, or another way to say that is to complete one's self-image. So there's a very strong foundation in the Feldenkrais method and these lessons that we do that is based on judo, based on martial arts, and based on his development as a scientist and a physicist and understanding how the brain and the nervous system work. So all this came together and eventually became the Feldenkrais method. And he moved from being a fighter into being a healer. And there's a tipping point in there somewhere, and that is said to be when he re-injured his knees severely, and that was a tipping point for him where he had to heal himself, and he started to apply all these ideas to himself, and then from there he started to work with other people, and then the Feldenkrais method was born, and he's taught for decades in Europe, in Israel, and in the United States.
That's incredible. My question is, and however this goes is how it goes, but for Moshe to go from what he was doing with martial arts to being classified, a scientist and so forth, and then all of a sudden a healer, was there something in there that he was seeking that, besides his knees? I guess it was just structural?
When he was a young man, he really tore his knees up when he was playing soccer. And he recovered his abilities, and then later in life, I guess it must have been around 50s, early 50s, maybe late 40s. There are people who know more about this timeline than I do. He had some kind of injury that re-injured his knees, and he had to relearn how to use them. And he started using these ideas that he'd been working with, and through science and martial arts and all this, and he regained use of his knees. So that's the tipping point, and I think it was more an emergent property of his study of martial arts, judo in particular, and his study of science, development, learning. All of these things kind of in a synergistic way came together, and I think the Feldenkrais method was an inevitable emergent property of his lifelong experience.
Right.
I think that those things were in place. Like I said, you can read the first 2 chapters of Higher Judo, and he's talking about how judo is a way to complete one's maturation to improve one's self-awareness. And basically, he's talking, if you take out judo, put in Feldenkrais method, it's the same thing.
One thing that just popped into my head is then, because there was it was considered a self-defense class out of Albuquerque that I was taking for a while, but it really wasn't self-defense because this instructor was very much about being aware and being mindful and so forth. And so this is kind of like what I'm getting is like, with Moshe, he was studying, it wasn't about defending yourself as much as it was really being present in your body and being centered, so to speak, and being able to be more, I don't want to use the word offensive, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
I would say the answer to that is no and yes.
Okay.
In that he was very much mindful of being of self-defense.
Okay.
And his, a lot of his bottom line is, can you defend yourself if you're attacked? Can you have that readiness and that ability to do that? That was, that came, out of his life history. It makes a lot of sense that was like a very important question to him. And yes, and at the same time, yeah, he's teaching how to be mindful, how to be aware, and how to be really proactive in your life to be who you are. And that way, again, is by removing a lot of the inhibitions that we picked up through society, through our development, through our parentage, and all that.
And so what I find interesting is that my life has taught me to be more aware and proactive as opposed to being self-defense. Being able to. So it's interesting again how that it makes sense to each one of us. It's a very individualized process.
You the method and the theory behind it all.
Yes.
So that's right there. That's half the battle.
Yeah, and I love talking about it. I love thinking about it. I spend many hours, probably every day, just mulling over ideas and lessons and all this stuff.
That's cool. I'd like to talk more about that. That's cool.
That's really great. I really appreciate you joining us tonight.
It was a blast. I love talking about the Feldenkrais method, and I can do this for hours on end.
Yeah.